Hello, everyone. This is Ellie again. I hope you've been having a really lovely time over there at the Make Your Heals. You've been in my prayers, and I'm really looking forward to hearing stories from this program and just how you're all going. So, today I'm going to be sharing another lecture with you all, and this one is going to be called Overcoming Addictions. Now, it's in two parts, so we'll start off with the first one, and just praying that God will really be with us and that He'll touch each of our hearts as we go through this material. So, our first part is called Part 1, Addiction and the Frontal Lobe. God has given us the health message to combat Satan's strategy. And as we go through this section, we're going to be having a look at what is Satan's strategy actually to counteract God's plan for us. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19 and 20, it says, "What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." So Satan's strategy is actually to use many of his temptations to destroy God's people and his sanctuary. And if you recall in that verse, it says that our body is God's temple or his sanctuary. So Satan's plan is to actually destroy this sanctuary at the end of time, this sanctuary in us that God wants to live in. So the health message that God has given us is actually to counteract Satan's plan and help to recover the sanctuary which Satan has attempted to destroy. Now in Revelation chapter 13, we see two beasts rising up, and each of these beasts represents Satan. So the first beast, the sea beast, is actually the little horn, which persecutes God's people. So it uses force, it uses manipulation to try and force God's people to follow a certain way. The other beast, the land beast or the earth beast, is secularism or atheism. Now, Satan is going to use these two strategies, secularism and atheism, at the end of time at the same time. So both of these he is going to use to try and deceive God's people into false worship. Now, it's very serious that we actually recognize this, because it becomes very clear why God has actually given us the health message. Why has he given us these principles to live by? Because they actually allow us to have clear minds and the discernment that we need to see Satan's deceptions, what he is going to try and do at the end of time to counteract God's plan, to destroy God's people, and to separate them basically from a relationship with him so that they can't be saved, to keep them from worshipping God in truth. Secularism is destroying our brain. So if you think of the word secularism or secular, what does it mean? Well, the definition of secular is not connected with religious or spiritual matters, or of or relating to the worldly or the temporal. So Satan is using this to destroy God's people. It's part of his plan to disconnect them from God and from true worship at the end of time. Now, our brain consists of billions of neurocells, and it's important that we actually understand how our brain cells are developed. So if you look at this image on the screen, you can see there are a number of neurons or brain cells, and these link up with each other and communicate. They send signals. Now, this happens when the swollen end of a telodendron, known as an axon, so you can see each one kind of has these tendrils which extend from the cell body, and then it's like they have little fingers which come out, and on the end of those is like a little swollen end. These are called axons, and they join with the dendrite or the cell body of another neuron at a little junction called a synapse. Now, you may have heard of the term synaptic connection. When this axon joins onto another cell at that little synapse, that junction, it forms a synaptic connection. And this allows the cells to communicate with each other and to send signals. And this is basically what is called neurotransmission. Now, there are specific materials used in neurotransmission, specifically amino acids, and you might recall some of these from our talk on water. Some of these are called tyrosine, tryptophan, serotonin, but today we're going to be talking about one in particular. I wonder if you can guess which one that is. Dopamine. So we're going to be talking about the specific amino acid called dopamine. Now, the reward system of our brain involves the transmission of dopamine from the VTA of the midbrain to the limbic system and then out to the prefrontal cortex. Now, when there's too much dopamine transmitted, that's when we actually become addicted to a behavior, when there is too much dopamine involved in transmission. Now, when we engage in pleasurable activities, a signal is sent down the neuron. So if you follow these 4 images on the screen, you'll kind of see this process. So a signal is sent down the neuron, which triggers the release of a neurotransmitter, dopamine, into the synaptic cleft, which is that space that you can see there in between the 2 neurons. So the neurotransmitter then binds to the receptors on a neighboring neuron, and this generates a signal in it, thereby transmitting the information to that neuron. This stimulation on the receiving neuron is believed to release the pleasurable feelings or rewarding effects. So you can see that in the 4th image there, those zigzagging red arrows, that's the pleasurable feelings which are activated because of the reception of dopamine. So if you look at this slide, you can see another 4 images. This is showing how dopamine is transported back into the receiving cell. So dopamine neurotransmitters are transported back from the synaptic space into the transmitting neuron by a special protein called a dopamine transporter. And you can see those are on the screen. They're those green tubes. Now, most addictive substances and behaviors, such as drugs of abuse, they actually increase the levels of dopamine in the reward pathway. So drugs like cocaine and methamphetamines in particular, they act as what we call nerve terminals. So you can see on the screen that there's orange and purple hexagons. These are those nerve terminals. They actually bind to the dopamine transporters and they block the reuptake of dopamine into the transmitting neuron. Now, different drugs, they work in different ways, but the end result is that dopamine actually builds up in the synaptic cleft to a much greater level than is normal. So you can see all the dopamine is kind of just sitting around there in the cleft between the two neurons. And this actually causes continual stimulation and is responsible for the prolonged and intense euphoria that's experienced by many drug users. Now, repeated exposure to the stimulation caused by these drugs actually eventually results in desensitization. The system is no longer responsive to everyday stimuli, and the only thing that is rewarding is the drug or that pleasurable activity. So this is actually how drugs or addictions in general actually change a person's life. They change their priorities. So after some time, even that addictive behavior loses its pleasure, it loses its reward. And that means that higher dosages are required then to stimulate the same amount of pleasure or those same amount of rewarding feelings. And you can see that in our 4th image here, there's plenty of dopamine there in the synaptic cleft, but there's none of those little zigzagging red arrows. So there's no rewarding effects that's actually occurring as a result of that dopamine. Now, in the body, there are normal or average levels of dopamine. So it's normal for us to actually have some dopamine in our body. And these average levels are actually called the dopamine set point or baseline. So when you're experiencing a pleasurable event, it results in a spike in the dopamine level in your brain. So in a normal brain, or what we really mean there is a non-addicted brain, small amounts of stimuli will actually produce quite a lot of pleasure. So for example, it might be a beautiful sunset or a walk in nature. It could be the smell of something really delicious cooking. It could be just having fun or laughing with your friends. So this is an example of a stimuli that will produce pleasure. And then after this causes a spike in dopamine, a quick return to the normal level will follow, back down to the baseline after that event, so that your body is then ready to enjoy another pleasurable event. So this is an example of basically what happens in a non-addicted brain. But if we look at an addicted brain, the process actually is quite different. So this slide here is an example of what an addicted brain looks like. And you can see here how there's a lot of peaks. So in an addicted brain, the set point or the baseline is actually reset. It may become higher or lower than normal. And this is the point, or the average level of dopamine in this person's body is actually higher or lower than normal. Now, excessive levels of pleasure over time causes the dopamine level not to return to the baseline or the set point, but it plunges to zero, which means there's no dopamine, and it often stays there. Now, this means that they need even more dopamine to reach a high. They need more pleasure, something to trigger their reward system. Now, the cycle continues, causing dopamine levels to crash even lower. This is why they can't even enjoy the small things anymore. They need more and more exciting and stimulating experiences. So someone who is addicted, you might be out walking with them and you're like, wow, look at that beautiful sunset. Look at the glow on the hills and the wildflowers. But it doesn't seem to even impact them at all, because for their dopamine to actually spike, they need something extremely rewarding or pleasurable. So you can see here that these highs, each of them transforms into a corresponding low. And with each succeeding behavior, the addicted person must use more and more to get less and less of an effect. So they build up a tolerance, basically. And it continues falling further and further until they are using drugs or whatever the addictive behavior might be, not to get to a high, but actually just to get back to normal. So with time, 75% of normal and then 50% of normal, they'll be content with that just to keep them out of the quicksand, basically. They'll do anything to avoid the withdrawal or the misery that comes from withdrawal. Now, research analysed about 101 men and women, and it found that those who are involved in religious activities have much better brain activity. Now, brain cells don't actually connect in a linear fashion. They cluster together. So this increases brain density. So you can see here on the screen that the healthy subjects have a much thicker frontal lobe than the drug abusers. So in drug addiction, the frontal lobe density actually thins out. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, being involved in religious activities, or having a relationship with God and connecting with Him actually increases our frontal lobe density. So do you remember what the definition of secular was? It was not having a connection to religious or spiritual matters, or relating to something worldly or temporal. So we can see that Satan's plan here really is to affect our brain, to destroy our brain through taking us away from things which are pertaining to God and giving us instead things which are pertaining to the world, but which actually destroy our brain power, our brain function. So all of this war basically is happening in our frontal lobe, our prefrontal cortex, or our moral compass. So what actually happens in our prefrontal cortex? Well, it's where our willpower is centered. It's our power of control. It's where our conscience is found, which is our knowledge of right from wrong. It governs our spiritual life. Now, if our prefrontal cortex becomes compromised, all of these abilities become compromised, which basically means that we become more like animals than humans. Now, animals' main functions are to eat, to sleep, to fight, and to mate. They live life according to their simple desires. And it's our frontal lobe capacity that actually makes us different from animals. But we can see here that Satan's last strategy is to destroy our frontal lobe, and he is seeking to do this through addiction, through making us addicted to things, basically to things which are not of God, apart from him. And in the beginning, we can see that Satan actually implementing this strategy right from the Garden of Eden. He was looking to see, well, what is it that I can use to actually make men and women addicted, to separate them from God and to start compromising their frontal lobe capacity? many of these addictions, as you can see on the screen, actually originate in the Garden of Eden. So let's have a look at some of them. We've got codependency, food and eating, gambling, sex, love, work, shopping, debit, internet, and games. So, among the top addictions are food and sexual addictions. And this is even in Christian circles. Now, if we go back to the Garden of Eden, we can see what was it that Eve chose, or what was one of the things that Eve chose over God? It was food. And if we look at Adam, he wanted Eve. He wanted love. He wanted that sexual intimacy with a partner. So food and sexual addictions, these are two of the top types of addictions that we see in our world today, even in the church. And we can see that they have come all the way down from the Garden of Eden. Let's have a bit of a talk about food addictions for a moment. Now, if we think about food that is made from white flour, could be a number of things. We actually see that things like white rice and white flour, after digestion, the nutritious elements are the same as sugar. Now, sometimes we're hungry. We think we're hungry because we're actually craving, it could be noodles, it could be bread, it could be cake, pastries. These are some of the things that we actually crave. But after consuming these foods, we experience the same withdrawals that we would have if we had eaten sugar, like candy or lollies or something like that. And that is because after digestion, the nutritious elements are the same as sugar. Now, some people, they have substantial weight, they're healthy, they have a healthy stomach, but they say, I can't fast. I have to have every meal. Why is that? Well, it's because they're addicted to carbs, this white flour. It's actually addiction. They can't control themselves because their body is craving the sugar that these foods turn into. Now, what about this slide? Does this make your stomach grumble or your mouth water? Well, people love oily and fried foods. Now, 100 years ago, it wasn't really like that because it was hard to access sugar and oily products. But now we can see foods like this, these fast foods, desserts, chips, donuts, burgers, all of these things, they're mass produced. Chips and chicken had to be fried in oil, otherwise people actually don't like them. So this is one reason, why there is so much of this available, because it's what people love, it's what they crave. And it's not just food either that we are addicted to. It can be anything: social media, our phones, movies, music, entertainment, shopping, pornography. All of these things actually drawing our youth and us, and they're influencing our frontal lobe. And this is a call that we need to recover our sanctuary, our body temple that God has created. But our frontal lobes are being destroyed. So how is it that we can actually recover them? Now, Ellen White, she talked a lot about the frontal lobe. However, back in her day, the terms that were used were not the same as what we would use today. But if we look closely at her writings, the greatest reason that she writes about the health message was not just to be healthy, but to actually keep our brain healthy. We needed warnings about Satan's strategy to compromise our frontal lobe. And God warned us through Ellen White in advance about how we were to eat and how we were to live, how to spend our leisure time. We were to control our worldly desires, including even our clothing and our appearance. She didn't give us a whole heap of legal instructions of don't do this, don't wear that, don't eat this specifically, which is the way a lot of Adventists actually accept her writings, the shoulds and the should nots. But she gave us many principles which we are to follow. We were taught, not to consume coffee, but not to feel guilty about drinking fruit juices full of sugar. We don't eat meat, but we don't worry about sharing hot chips. This is actually what happens when we focus on legalism and not actually the principles. Now, Ellen White, she draws some really powerful lines in her writings. She says that ministers who eat meat can't be saved. It's not an arbitrary pronunciation by God. The frontal lobe is compromised when we eat these foods, as we learned before. Our frontal lobe is compromised. We lose the power of our will, of our conscience. All of these things, we aren't able to use them properly, and so we aren't able to accept or connect with God properly. And that way, if we can't connect with him properly, that means that he can't live in us, and the recovery of our body temple or our sanctuary is impossible, which is what Jesus is wanting to do before he comes again. And so, in essence, Satan's strategy is to prevent Christ from being able to come again through compromising our frontal lobe. So the salvation of the entire universe is actually at stake in the battle to protect our prefrontal cortex. We can see that the health message and the three angels' messages are so closely connected. Why is it that there are some foods that we can't eat? Why are there some behaviors that we can't or definitely should not engage in? Because we are preparing for Jesus to come. We are a unique people living at this time in Earth's history, so close to Jesus coming. We are waiting for him to come. And it's not just about our own personal salvation. Other churches say that Adventists, they want to be saved by not eating meat. But it's not that it's just related to the method of our salvation. It's not related to that at all, actually. It's not just about our personal salvation, but the salvation of the entire universe. At the end of time, sin will be destroyed and there's going to be a judgment before Jesus comes. Now, we are to be witnesses to the great controversy over sin. And it's not just a personal matter to protect our frontal lobe. We're called here for the mission of saving the entire universe. If we are to be representatives of Christ, to have him living in us so that others can see the power of the gospel, so that a watching universe can see that God is just, that he can keep us from sinning, that he can make us like him, then we need to keep our frontal lobes healthy and strong so that we can connect with him. Addiction is stealing the power of our free will. Now, I'm sure that any of you can attest to the fact that as much as you enjoy some behaviors, you also hate the fact that you enjoy them. You hate the fact that you engage in them. You hate the fact that you can't stop doing them. I know that's been true for me in the past and for things that I struggle with today as well. So let's look at this example of a boy who is addicted to gaming. He wants to play games more than anybody else, but just as much he doesn't want to play the games just as much as he wants to. So you can imagine he's just been at school and he's telling himself, when I get home, I will not game. I'm going to study. But although he chooses not to, when he gets home, he finds himself sitting in front of the computer, and that's where he stays for the next few hours. Most people who are addicted to gaming, to anything, they don't actually want to game. They don't want to be tied to these things. People who are addicted to carbs, they desperately don't want to eat. But addiction disables the willpower. Even if our decision making is strong, the will is powerless to say no. Basically, sinners can't do anything. The boy, he doesn't want a game. He's in the middle of playing. He tells himself after one round, I'm going to stop. But then hours pass by. Mum comes in, and how do you think he's feeling? He pretends that he's studying, but Mum, of course, being Mum, she knows what's going on. And she speaks to him sternly, and then what happens? His stress level shoots right up. He doesn't have the power to control his stress. So he speaks to her in a way that he knows he shouldn't, and even he doesn't want to, but he can't stop himself. He reacts in violent and aggressive ways. This is the result of addiction. Our conscience is numbed. The power of our will is disabled. So we've talked a bit about how Satan is using secularism to destroy our frontal lobes. God designed us to be eager for eternity, but our young people, many of them are not eager for eternity. And if we ask ourselves, am I personally eager for eternity? Sadly, a lot of us have to say that we're not actually. Young people say it's good to be saved, but I don't want to live eternally. And why is that? Well, it's because they're not satisfied with their present lives. So if they're not satisfied with their lives here, why would they want to live like that forever? If our frontal lobe is no longer functioning, our purpose as a creation of God is gone. In essence, these young people, or anybody who is feeling like this, they're actually rejecting the fact that they were created. They're rejecting creation and taking a knowledge of good and evil. So Satan, he has tried to make us reject creation through intemperance, rejecting the fact that God made this world, rejecting life itself, leads to rejecting God, the Creator. And this is basically the definition of atheism, rejecting God himself as our Creator. Now, young people, they do not really have a passion for good or for the right way of living. Most of them find their hope in food, in travel, in sexual relationships. On Sabbath, they may go to church, but then in the evening they live for dopamine. In Korea, there was a study or a survey done, and it was found that about 50 years ago, 52% of young people were Christians. But now, when they measured religious activity of young people in about their 20s, only 20% were religious and 80% were atheist. So they asked these young people who they surveyed this question, why are you atheist? And they gave them the option of answering in 3 different ways. The first was, I'm not satisfied with religious people. I cannot accept religious theory. I am not interested in religion. Now, which one do you think was the most commonly answered? Well, it was the third one. I'm not interested in religion. Why is this? Well, it's because their frontal lobes have been damaged. They just became an atheist automatically. There was no reason or conscience involved in the decision because these powers, the powers of their mind, have been damaged by the things that they have been engaging in. Just over 2 short decades, 80% of young people in Korea became atheist. This really signals what we're told in God's word, that the love of many has become cold. It will become cold at the end of time. And this is the atheism that Ellen White warned us about. In the past, we've been told that it's going to be through science or humanitarianism that atheism will arise. But actually, this is not really the case. It's through addiction, which is Satan's strategy, that atheism will arise or is arising now, as we can see. So that's the end of my first part of this lecture. So we're just going to take a short break now and then we'll come back for part 2.